Chapter 6. Scrape, Scrape, Scrape. As Edmund lay dying on his cot, he heard a noise, a constant scraping. His dungeon was infested with rats and large bugs, but this scraping was different from any of their sounds. Edmund raised his head weakly and listened harder. The sound was like a large claw scraping on the stone wall near his cot. His heart gave a great lurch as he realized that some prisoner was attempting to escape. The thought of someone making his way to freedom made Edmund feel dizzy. He told himself that his weakness was making him hear things. But the sound continued. It cannot be a workman for the prison, Edmund reasoned, because it is the middle of the night. His starving body then caused him to fall into a disturbed sleep. He awoke in the morning angry with himself. Perhaps some fellow sufferer was trying to signal him, and he had not heard. When the jailer brought his breakfast, Edmund gobbled it up. His desire for death had vanished. Now his one thought was to make contact with whoever was scraping. After breakfast, Edmund waited tensely by the wall for an hour. Then it came. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He leaped up and grabbed his chair. Knocking the back of the chair against the wall, he made a clunking noise. He did it 3 times. At once the scraping stopped. Edmund knocked 3 times more. Trembling, he waited to hear something. Anything. For an hour he stood there, holding the chair, ready to respond. At last the sound behind the wall came again. In a fever of joy, Edmund beat the back of the chair against the wall. Then he stopped suddenly, fearful that a jailer might hear him. To calm his rapidly beating heart, he threw himself down on his cot. There he reproached himself for wasting 12 years by never trying to escape, as the man behind his wall was trying. This thought propelled Edmund off his cot and into a search for something to scrape with. His cot had iron clamps, but they were screwed tightly into the wood. His eyes lit up when he saw his water mug. Without hesitation, he dropped the mug onto the stone floor. It broke, and Edmund selected the largest and sharpest fragment. Then, he attacked the wall with it. The scraping on the other side was so much like a companionship that Edmund found himself crying with happiness. The plaster that held the stones of the wall together was crumbly from age and from the dampness of the dungeon. Edmund scraped vigorously and was soon rewarded by a shower of plaster dust and small pieces of stone. He worked through the day. Before his jailer arrived with dinner, he moved his bed to conceal the loosening stone. He trickled the plaster dust out the window, then hid his scraper under his blanket and lay down on top of it. Edmund was given another mug. The jailer did not notice that one large piece of the broken mug was missing when he swept the fragments from the dungeon. After dinner, Edmund waited an hour before daring to go back to his task. While he waited, he rested because he was still weak from starving himself. This pattern continued for the next 2 days. By then, Edmund had cleared all the plaster from the sides of one stone. But when he tried to move the huge slab, his fingers could not budge it. He needed a lever to work the stone out. Desperately, Edmund examined his dungeon. Nothing. "I cannot fail now," he told himself, pacing back and forth in his anxiety. The jailers had begun bringing around dinner. The clank of their utensils came to Edmund's ears along with an idea. His nightly soup was brought in an iron pot. Its iron handle would make a perfect lever, but the jailer usually poured his soup from this pot into his plate and took the pot away with him. Suppose, Edmund whispered to himself with a wild surge of hope, just suppose I did not have a plate. Quickly, he put his plate in front of the door, then flung himself on his cot to watch and hope. Edmund's jailer entered. All his attention was centered on not spilling the soup. so he did not see the plate before his heavy foot crunched down on it. "Look what you have made me do," complained the jailer. "You have left your plate in my way. First your mug, now your plate. Do you think our citizens have nothing to do with their tax money but buy you dishes?" He was angry with Edmund, but also with himself, for it was his foot that broke the dish. "All right, take the pot for your soup plate. See if you can keep that in one piece." Edmund almost fainted with joy. At most he had hoped to have the iron pot for one night. Now it was to be his permanently. That night he levered the big stone out easily with the pot handle, and set to work scraping around the next stone. A passageway began to form, with the first stone being moved in and out to conceal the entrance. Edmund found that the stones beyond it could be pushed under a wooden beam that arched in back of the wall. The day came when Edmund and the first scraper were working on the same stone from opposite ends. Edmund scraped with almost insane energy until they moved the last stone aside. On their knees in the passageway, the two prisoners faced one another. They stretched out trembling hands and touched. Edmund drew the other man forward while he inched backward toward his entrance. Back in his dungeon, Edmund reached down and helped the other man to his feet. "Who are you?" Edmund asked. His voice shook so that he had to repeat the question. The man answered, "I am Father Fariah. The jailers call me the Mad Priest."